A few years ago, I made a video about the very first Batman story, published in 1939 on March the 30th. Hey, that's today! And the fact that Batman's creators, artist Bob Kane and writer Bill Finger, were heavily inspired by a pulp story about a sinister supernatural sleuth styled The Shadow. I used this for the thumbnail, and in true YouTuber fashion, it features art that Bob Kane didn't actually use in the story under discussion in that video, so it was never explained what this thumbnail is about. Quite a few of you pointed that out in the comments, and you're right, I should make a video about that. And here it is. This art by Bob Kane comes from Detective Comics issue number 33, the 6th story about the Dark Knight, called Batman Wars Against the Dirigible of Doom. It's the final panel in a succinct and significant summary of Batman's origin, a part of the canon that has remained pretty much untouched. And it is transparently taken from this piece of art by Hal Foster, drawn for an adaptation of Edgar Rice Burroughs' classic novel Tarzan of the Apes. Foster drew a daily 5-panel strip for 10 weeks, published in America in 1929. This panel comes from strip number 34. By my reckoning, this drawing was published on February the 14th, 1929.
Valentine's Day. Bummer.
But the point is that it was published 10 years before Bob Kane swiped it for Batman. And I use that word swiped very deliberately, because swipe is the industry term for comic book art that is basically stolen from other artists, rather than say art that is inspired by or paying homage to other artists. But how do you tell the difference? I think you know. It's the difference between trying to hide what you're doing and not hiding it. For example, consider one of the most famous pieces of art in history, Leonardo da Vinci's painting of the Last Supper. It's one of the most reproduced pieces of art in the world, but it's so famous and so reproduced that it's transparent whenever a painter, photographer, or filmmaker chooses to recreate it, because everyone recognizes it. In fact, artists rely on the audience's familiarity with Da Vinci's painting because often they use the placement of their subjects in their homage to inform the viewer of something about the subject occupying the position parallel to one of the figures in the original painting. Whoever gets placed in the center, for example, is clearly being compared to Jesus in some way, while whoever gets Judas's seat probably doesn't come off so well. Pop culture uses this quite a bit, like in Watchmen's famous opening credits. And frankly, it's a risk to recreate this piece of art now, because if you do, your placement of where your pop culture characters go in this painting better be well thought out, because the viewer is so familiar with the original that they know what the significance of each placement is. Swiping, on the other hand, is exactly what the name suggests, is taking another artist's work and passing it off as yours because you're either too hurried, too lazy, or too uninspired to invent your own. And I think the giveaway in this panel by Bob Kane is the perspective. Obviously, Batman's whole pose translates directly onto Tarzan's pose, in the arms and the legs and the head, but apart from the costume change, Bob Kane hasn't really altered it. So much so that even the feet are in the same position. Their placement makes sense in Hal Foster's drawing because we're viewing Tarzan's feet from above after he's just landed on a branch. And I can say this with some confidence because Hal Foster had a habit of drawing Tarzan in the trees from a high perspective looking down on the characters. That was his style. But look at the angle from which we're viewing Batman here. We're looking up at him on the rooftop. If we weren't looking up, we couldn't see the chimney and the moon behind him, which then makes it look like he's barely touching the roof tiles. In fact, he looks like he could be floating when you think about the proportion of his feet we can see from this angle. We really shouldn't be able to see much below his ankles. His feet should be blocked by the gutter. At best, I can give Bob Kane the benefit of the doubt and say that we're looking at Batman the split second that he stealthily, softly, delicately lands on the roof, the moment before his feet become invisible to us. But maybe I'm being unfair. Maybe Bob Kane was just paying tribute to Hal Foster. Well, to me, the obvious clue that he swiped this is that there is nothing about this panel that gives any indication to the reader that it's paying homage to Hal Foster. It's simply a normal-sized panel at the end of page 2 of a comic story before the main plot has even kicked off. I'm also skeptical that one panel of Hal Foster's art from 1929 in strip number 34 of 60 would be so iconic that the readers of Detective Comics in 1939, and let's remember the target audience was kids, would instantly recognize the art and get the reference. But I could be wrong. Tarzan was reprinted in 1938, so maybe both Bob and his target audience had seen Hal Foster's art merely months before Batman made his debut. However, the clincher may be that in the same story on the same page, just 2 panels to the left of this debatable homage to Hal Foster's art, is this famous panel of Bruce Wayne deep in contemplation of what persona to adopt in his war on crime. It looks very similar to a panel from a 1938 story, Gangbusters in Action, drawn by Henry Valley. It depicts Captain Olsen deep in thought over a potentially murderous plot. To be fair, this clearly hasn't been traced, merely copied by Bob Kane. The irony is he might have done a better job if he'd traced it. Funnily enough, comparing these images reveals a mistake by the colouring artist on Batman. When you look closely, you can see that Bob Kane drew the lines for the fingers of Bruce Wayne's left hand tucked into his right inner elbow, just as in Henry Valley's original. But the colorist has filled those fingers with the same color of Bruce's jacket. Whether we're looking at the recolored reprint or the original, the mistake exists. Henry Valley was clearly a favourite artist of Bob Kane's, because the very first Batman story swiped this panel, showing Gordon Commissioner's car, from this panel by Valley, again from 1938's Gangbusters in Action. And swiping is common in Bob Kane's early Batman art. Even the cover of the very first Batman story is based on a panel from Flash Gordon by artist Alex Raymond. I don't know what the artists Kane swiped from thought of it. Maybe they were flattered. Maybe they didn't care. Hal Foster, for instance, thought working on Tarzan was slumming it, just an easy paycheck during the Great Depression. And in 1937 he created the comic he'd be best remembered for, Prince Valiant, a huge critical and commercial success that Foster owned himself. Would he really have given much thought to Batman? And it must be said that Bob Kane wasn't alone in swiping art. I mean, it was a common enough practice that the industry invented a nickname for it. However, anyone who dismisses the fact, let alone the scale of Bob Kane's swiping, just because loads of other people also did it, is guilty of the tu quoque fallacy, which is a fancy Latin way of saying 2 wrongs don't make a right. After all, just because everyone else is looting the local store doesn't mean you can also do it and not be guilty of committing a crime. And in the spirit of making it clear that I'm not trying to pass off other people's work as my own, I owe a huge debt of gratitude to the research done by the Lair of the Silver Fox blog, the Valley Archives blog, and numerous comic book fans online. I also recommend you check out the Panelosity blog for loads of great examples of comic book art that has either been swiped from or inspired by other artists. I've put some links in the description below for you to do some more research, and I swear that at the time of making this video, all those links are live and discoverable, unlike the great Dial B for blog which I mentioned in my previous video on Bob Kane's brazen plagiarism. So, there you have it. The story behind this thumbnail, and an introduction to the amount of art swiped by Bob Kane, the sole creator of Batman, except for the costume, backstory, and the name Bruce Wayne, which were created by Bill Finger. And yes, this is the correct image this time. For the record, I still love Batman. He's still my favourite superhero, and I still think that the greatest graphic novels ever written, the greatest superhero video games ever made, the greatest Saturday morning cartoon for kids, and the greatest live-action superhero films ever all belong to Batman. Then again, so do some of the worst. Does my love, that is shared with millions of people around the world, for Batman justify what Bob Kane did, or at least excuse it? I don't think so. But he did it, he got away with it, and he died a very famous and very rich man. So now, years after his passing, it's up to the people who helped make him rich, us fans, to set the record straight and publicly acknowledge that sometimes great things come from sinister beginnings. Together, we need to bring the Dark Knight into the light. How's that for a sign-off? I hope you found this video interesting. Thank you so much for watching it, and well done for making it to the end. I do encourage you to go out there, read some comic books, enjoy them, have fun, but always think about maybe where the artists and the writers are getting their ideas from. It's a fun exercise to do. If you enjoyed this video, then please give it a like, subscribe if you haven't already, click the bell notification to keep up to date on all of our future uploads. At the moment, it'll be about one a month for the foreseeable future. Hope you enjoy these mini documentaries we make, and if you enjoyed our company, then please do check out our podcast, the Just Interesting Podcast, our weekly episodes about anything and everything that we find just interesting. Thanks for your support, and we'll see you next time.